Hello. I want to talk to you today a bit about Ascension Day, which is almost upon us. We celebrate it on Thursday, the 13th of May this year. The ascension of Jesus, of course, happened after his resurrection from the dead, when he'd come and he'd spent more time with his disciples and followers, and then he left them as he ascended into heaven. This day is often forgotten by the world and also by the church, and yet it is such an important day in our faith. It's also a day that now marks the beginning of the now international movement known as Thy Kingdom Come, in which Christians all over the world are called to come together and to pray in earnest for people to come to know Christ. We're each encouraged to pray specifically for 5 people to come to faith. And last year, I prayed very specifically for 5 people and invited some of them to come to our Alpha course. It was so exciting then to see them come to faith, to see those prayers get answered. And it's lovely to know that they're all now continuing in their Christian faith and deepening in that. So I do encourage you during this time of Thy Kingdom Come, which starts on Ascension Day and finishes at Pentecost, just 10, 11 days later, to be praying specifically for 5 people. But of course, you don't have to stop praying on Pentecost Sunday. You can keep praying for them as the days and weeks go on. But let's just go back to Ascension Day itself for a moment. We hear about it in Acts chapter 1, verses 6 to 11. I'm going to read that to you. So when they'd come together, they asked him, "Lord, is this the time when you will restore the kingdom to Israel?" He replied, "It is not for you to know the times or periods that the Father has set by his own authority, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." When he had said this, as they were watching, he was lifted up, and a cloud took him out of their sight. While he was going, and they were gazing up towards heaven, suddenly 2 men in white robes stood by them. They said, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking up towards heaven? This Jesus who has been taken up from you into heaven will come in the same way as you saw him go into heaven." There's so much to say about this important day, but for today's thought, I'm going to try and keep it as brief as I can. And I want to invite you just to see for a moment the important connection between absence and presence. A little story about myself and Tim. Tim, my husband, and I first met when I was training for ordination. And I was doing a 3-month placement in my home country of Zimbabwe, where Tim happened to be working. Now, I hadn't gone all that way expecting to meet my future husband, but not long after my arrival, meet we did. And certainly I, anyway, fell in love. I'd like to hope that he might have done as well. Before we knew it, the 3 months was gone, and I had to return to complete my training in this country, and Tim had to stay working because he was there for many, many, many more months to come. And so there began a relationship for which the next 2 years was punctuated by absence and presence. There was no internet even allowing us to connect remotely like there would be today. And so we'd spend months apart from one another, maybe just hearing every now and again from each other by one of those blue airmail letters, which I'm sure many of you will remember. But whilst it was really hard, what it also did was confirm how much I loved this man, how much I missed him. His absence brought that into even sharper focus. So that's enough about me and Tim. But on the day that Jesus ascended, And of course, let's not be fooled that heaven literally is up there somewhere in the sky, but that too is a thought for another day. But on this day, his followers were left looking up, saying, he's gone. They were left with an absence. They'd been used to having his physical presence right with them. And they were left with this empty space, if you like. Jesus' absence reminded them of how much they needed him. But yes, you see, he wasn't physically present with them on earth anymore. But of course, that didn't mean he wasn't present, because Christ is everywhere. That was part of what his ascension was about. Christ is now everywhere. He dwells in me. He dwells in you. He is everywhere we look, in everything. And when we feel empty and powerless, we're reminded more than ever of how much we need him. And it's so often in those moments of empty space, when we struggle, when we feel alone, that we're most likely to rely and long for God's infinite presence with us. And it's then that we can grow closer to him. His seeming absence, you see, can lead us into a greater experience of his presence. But of course it goes further than that as well, doesn't it? Because we're called also to be his presence in the world. We're called to make Christ known. And so Jesus' ascension was the beginning of the story of the church, in which we're called to get on with the work that Jesus started. Stop looking up in the sky, said the angels. You need to get on with it now. Jesus has handed it over to you. Jesus' ascension calls us to bring Christ into that little corner of the world in which we find ourselves. It calls us to be Christ, to be witnesses to his love, to his compassion, to his forgiveness. To be Christ as we stand up against injustice and oppression. We have a part to play. And rather than just, as the disciples had got used to doing, just relying on Jesus being present with them and doing it all, Jesus is saying, no, I'm going and I'm leaving it with you. I'm dwelling within you. I'm giving you my power and my spirit, so you're not abandoned, you're not alone, but you need to be carrying on the work. Isn't that amazing that he entrusts it to us? He had to leave his disciples that first time round to get going on sharing his love throughout the world. And that is also our call. But let us not forget that when we suffer and struggle along the way, when we feel that empty space, we can rejoice that Christ has ascended to God's right hand, that he does have authority over all, that he is within us and around us, empowering us every step of the way. May you know the power of the ascended Christ living within you today and in the days to come.